Hey guys, what's up? This is Alex Duque. Welcome back with another tutorial. This tutorial is actually pretty simple, but it is not only a very common thing to do, but it is a pretty helpful thing as well. So I don't know if you ever heard of the term ambient occlusion. What it is an effect that happens in life. What happens is if you ever have, let's say, a surface. Let's use another color here. If you have a surface, let's say this, and this is like an effect that happens in life. The shadows, as they get closer to the edges, it tends to get darker there. Another effect of ambient occlusion that's pretty easy to notice is if you grab your hand and just look at your hand for a second, and if you have your fingers closed, your palm open but the fingers are just closed, wherever those creases are on the fingers, you see it gets darker there. That's another effect of ambient occlusion. It's just how light starts to dim off as it gets closer and closer to those recesses. So it's a pretty helpful thing, and it makes things look a little bit more realistic. So how do you do it? There's a couple of ways to do it, but I personally like this method. It's pretty helpful and pretty handy. So how do you go about that? You have these two objects. So I just made this interesting looking object here because this would be a great place to see the ambient occlusion. In this area it should be pretty dark, but it gets pretty light on the outside. So it's a good place to notice that. And I have this floor plane here, so you can see how the occlusion that this guy creates in that floor plane is also something to notice. So I got these two objects, and all you have to do really is you go to the render layers and you select your objects and you add them to a render layer. That's it. So now when I go to layer 1, there they are. So I'm going to call this occlusion. Now, to make the occlusion, like I said, there's a couple of ways, but the best way to do it is the following. You make a surface shader. You go to create mental nodes, and you look for a node under textures that's called MIB ambient occlusion. And you connect that MIB to the color of the surface shader. And of course you assign the surface shader to those objects while on that layer. That way, the master layer still has color in it. And render perspective. So just right off the bat, you're gonna get occlusion. And you can see the effect of what I'm talking about right here. So that is, in its foundation, ambient occlusion. Now if you want to get a little bit more fancy, you can. Let's talk about a couple of settings about the ambient occlusion. There's these samples. The samples is the quality. That, of course, also has to do with the render settings. So before you start changing your samples, you want to make sure you're rendering in production quality, because that will actually fix a lot of those pixels that you see there, all that artifacting, all those low samples. That's because it's on draft. So take it to production and that will be improved just a tad, but it'll be improved. There we go. So there's the render, and as you can see, it's looking a little bit better. This is what we had, this is what we have now. Before, after. Draft settings, production settings. So you can see that a lot of that aliasing, a lot of those artifacts are fixed. But it's not all the way. So now that you have this, you can start doing test renders. So I'm going to increase the samples to 64 and see what results that gives us. There we go. It's a little bit nicer. I can get higher. I can go 128, and that's going to make it a lot nicer at the expense of render times. So now it's nice and smooth. But for now, because we're testing this out, I'm going to keep it at 64. That way you don't have to wait a long time for the render, and I don't have to wait a long time for the render. still a long time, but it's not as long as if it was 128. So there we go. We have ambient occlusion generated on this object. If you want to change a couple more settings, you can definitely do that. And here's the case in which you want to do that. I'm just going to go ahead and change this up a little bit. So I'm just going to select this and extrude it up so that this guy is like inside of an environment, like so. Oops. Sorry, I had keep faces. There we go. So now this guy is in that enclosed environment. And because it's in that enclosed environment, I'll just go back to the render settings here for the sample. So I'm going to take them back to 32 so it doesn't take so long to render. But before, this is what we were getting, and now that this guy is enclosed in that space, then the ambient occlusion is not really going to work. See, it's all black, and that's because that cube environment is blocking the view, and that's not something you want, right? So let's just double check here and make the render, and it's all black because, like I said, that environment, it's occluding all the light coming from the outside. So inside it's all black. Of course, if I am outside, then everything looks fine and groovy. It's pretty much going to be white because there's nothing to occlude there. But if I'm inside, it's all black. So that's when you have to change some other settings on the ambient occlusion. Now, because we're test rendering, I'm going to go back to draft, since you already know that it's going to look pixelated. So you had these values: spread, maximum distance, and fall off. Right now, the maximum distance is set at 0. If it's at 0, it'll just occlude from the furthermost to the closermost point, if you want to think of it like that. So because this is inside of an enclosed environment, and just having a little bit of an understanding, you'll say, oh, okay, I want it to occlude, say, from, let's just draw it out here, from this point till that point in the plane. Let me see if I can do arrows here. Apparently no. Okay, so anyway, if I wanted to go from here to here, then there's a distance of occlusion, if that makes any sense. So you have to sort of like figure out the scale of your scene. The best thing to do here is to create a measure tool, distance tool, and I'm just gonna view this on default material so that I can see what's going on. And if I just go from there to there, I get a distance, see? So it says 0.7. So if that's the distance I wanted to occlude, it would be 0.6. If I wanted to occlude from there to there, that would be 1.13, just more or less. So I'm just gonna undo. There we go. And on the maximum distance, I'm going to type that number, so somewhere like 1.5. So that's going to be the maximum distance for the occlusion. And remember that it was black. Now there will be occlusion, but that occlusion is going to happen within that distance. And voila, you can also see it there, see? So it's a 1.5 units of occlusion. And you can go playing with those values until you get the result that you want. Just keep in mind that you use occlusion to multiply over another layer. So you don't want to get a lot of darks. You want to get, you know, a nice white value for the most part, and just get the occlusion where you need it. And that takes care of that. So just one more thing to expand on the same topic is, I'm just going to delete this layer. And oops, delete layer, and let's delete layer. I'm just sort of like going to start all over from scratch. So again, I'm going to select these two objects, make a new render layer, and this is another option. Okay, so this is option 2. I hope you can see the numbers. Okay, so this is option 2, which is doing the same thing, just a little bit different. Instead of assigning the surface shader to the objects while on the layer, one interesting and pretty good approach is to assign that surface shader to everything within the layer. And you know, in some cases that's maybe what you want to do. So rather than having to select all your objects and all that stuff, you can simply right click on the render layer, go to overrides, create a new material override, make it a surface shader, and that will assign the surface shader to every object that's on this layer. And then you do the same thing just on the surface shader. So here we go, out color, and I'm going to map my MIB, ambient occlusion, mental ray, textures, mental ray light, there we go. MIB ambient occlusion, it's mapped onto the color, 64 samples, and a maximum distance of 1. What was it, 1 point? I did 3 for this one, so there we go, 3. And make a render of this layer, and voila! So, quick and dirty, but it works. It's actually not dirty. That's pretty much the way you do it. That way you won't affect your color and any other things that you have. One more thing, which is actually for compositing purposes. I'm going to call this occlusion. You can actually set this to multiply. And although you're not actually going to render, you're going to render all the separate layers and stuff, you can just set it to multiply, render all layers, and you can see how the occlusion is going to multiply over the layer underneath. Now, the layer underneath is not renderable, so I'm going to make it renderable. And now, with render all layers, it's going to render both layers and multiply the occlusion over the color and give me a composite rough, but at least I get to see a sample of what that's going to look like. Alrighty guys, so till next time, I hope that made sense and I didn't go too fast. But anyway, I'll see you. Bye bye.